My name is Emily, and revenge found me before I even sought it. One message uncovered the lies of a woman who destroyed my family. For years she thrived in shadows, but the truth landed in my lap, and I swore she would finally pay for every betrayal. I never thought revenge could arrive in such a twisted way. In my life with her, it began decades before I even met her. My ex grew up with a father who adored her but was too weak to protect her when his second wife made it clear the child from his first marriage would never be welcome. From the very beginning, that woman played the part of the classic evil stepmother. It wasn't loud or obvious at first. It was subtle, sly remarks, controlling the attention in the room, pushing the girl to the margins. Then, when she and her father had children together, the subtleties vanished. My ex was packed off to boarding school as though she were an embarrassment, out of sight and out of mind. Her father let it happen, torn by guilt but unwilling to fight the war inside his own home. He visited when he could, sent letters, bought her small gifts, but those things don't replace the daily presence of a parent. He always meant well, but his weakness carved a permanent gap between them. She grew up convinced that her father's loyalty to his wife outweighed his love for her. By the time she became an adult, she had buried her hope of ever having a real bond with him. She learned to survive without it. What she didn't bury was the memory of being pushed aside, of being told she didn't belong, of the woman who engineered her exile. That bitterness shaped her. It gave her steel. It gave her an edge sharp enough to build a career around uncovering the secrets of others. That's where I came in. Together, she and I opened a private investigations firm. At first, it was a gamble, but we found our niche quickly. Cheating cases became our bread and butter. We had a talent for spotting lies. Husbands slipping into motels, wives claiming late nights at work while meeting someone else, lovers who thought they were clever but weren't half as invisible as they believed. We turned their carelessness into evidence, and our clients paid us to hand them the truth they already suspected. In envelopes and files, we delivered betrayal again and again. There was irony in our work. Every day, we uncovered infidelity in strangers' lives, yet neither of us looked too closely at the one place betrayal had been festering for years, her own family. She didn't talk much about her father. When she did, it was flat, resigned. He was a distant figure chained to a woman who had long since proven her cruelty. She no longer expected anything from him. The wound of her childhood had scarred over, but it never healed. And then, everything shifted on what should have been an ordinary morning. We were preparing to head out of town for a job when her phone buzzed with a Facebook notification. At first, she ignored it. Random messages rarely led anywhere good. But something made her open this one. It was simple, almost blunt. A stranger asked if she knew her stepmother. She hesitated before replying. When she confirmed, the response came immediately. The man introduced himself as a firefighter. His wife had cheated on him months earlier, leaving him with scars he carried daily. He explained he couldn't watch someone else suffer blindly. The night before, while driving down a rural road, he saw two cars pulled over. Assuming trouble, he stopped to help. What he discovered wasn't an emergency. It was two people entangled in an affair, careless enough to be caught by headlights. He took photos quickly, then left before they noticed him. Later, running the plates revealed two different last names, two separate addresses. They weren't married to each other. They were married to other people. He had tried to track down the husband but couldn't find him online. Instead, he found her, the daughter. He told her what he'd seen and attached the photos. I watched her face as she scrolled. First disbelief, then shock, and finally something I had never seen from her before. Tears poured down her cheeks, but these weren't tears of sorrow. She was crying from relief, from vindication, from a joy that was almost savage in its purity. She laughed through them, gripping the phone as if it were a key she had been searching for all her life. In those photos, a stranger had handed her more than evidence of infidelity. He had given her revenge for her childhood. He had given her a way to expose the woman who had stolen her father from her and destroyed their bond. For years she had endured the memory of being cast aside, powerless to do anything about it. Now, suddenly, she had proof that the stepmother wasn't the perfect wife she pretended to be. She was exactly what my ex always believed: selfish, manipulative, and unfaithful. She wanted to confront her instantly, to unleash years of buried anger in one blow. But I stopped her. Revenge requires patience. I told her to wait, to let the truth simmer, to plan carefully. At first, she hated the thought of delaying. She paced the room, stared at the photos again and again, restless with the need to act. But eventually she agreed. For 24 hours, she carried that phone like a weapon she couldn't use yet, her eyes sharp, her body tense, her mind racing with possibilities. The next day, we took the first step. We called her father and asked him to lunch. He didn't suspect anything. He arrived the same way he always did, quiet, withdrawn, resigned. When he sat across from her, she didn't waste words. She slid the phone across the table. He picked it up, frowning at first, then scrolling carefully. His expression changed in layers. Confusion melted into shock. Shock hardened into recognition. And then, unexpectedly, his face softened with relief. He set the phone down and let out a long, uneven breath, as though he had been carrying the weight of suspicion for years and had finally been given permission to release it. He admitted what he had never dared say aloud. His marriage had been a prison. His wife had controlled him with manipulation and cruelty for years. He had suspected something was wrong, but he had been too worn down to fight. Now the proof was in front of him, undeniable and irrefutable. He didn't rage. He didn't cry. Instead, he looked at his daughter in a way I had never seen before. For the first time, there was no wall of guilt between them. There was gratitude, even pride. He told her she had given him something he never thought he'd have again, a way out. But he was also cautious. He knew his wife. He knew how she fought, how she twisted facts, how she could spin lies into chains. If he confronted her with only these photos, she would deny, manipulate, and drag the fight through courts and children until he was trapped again. What he wanted wasn't an argument. He wanted an ending. That was when the decision became clear. The photos were only the beginning. We needed more. We needed evidence so overwhelming that she couldn't claw her way out. We needed to strip her of her power, just as she had stripped him of his. For years, we had hunted down cheaters for others. Now it was time to turn those skills inward. This wasn't just another case. This was the most important one of all. And so, without her knowing, the countdown to her downfall began. The moment her father admitted the truth, the urgency to act grew sharper. But we both knew photographs taken by a stranger on a deserted road, while powerful, weren't enough to shatter years of manipulation in a court battle. Her stepmother was cunning, and if cornered too quickly, she'd twist the story until the victim looked like the villain. I had seen this tactic countless times in our work, and I wasn't about to let it play out in her favor. Proof was power, and we needed more of it. My ex and I made a pact that very afternoon. We would take the case on ourselves, fully and methodically, as though her stepmother were any other cheating spouse. We would trail her, document everything, and build a record so airtight no lawyer or lie could dismantle it. Her father agreed, though I could see the mix of emotions in his face. Relief mingled with hesitation. He had lived under her domination for years, and even now, part of him feared what would happen if she realized she was being watched. But when my ex explained that it was the only way to secure his freedom, his resolve hardened. He wanted out, and we were the ones to deliver it. We began immediately. Step 1 was to learn her patterns. Every cheater has them, the excuses they repeat, the habits that conceal their secrets, the routines that don't quite add up. In this case, the alibi was obvious. She was an avid cyclist, a passion she claimed took her away for hours on end. What her husband believed to be long rides were, in reality, extended meetings with someone else. He admitted that he had always thought her trips were excessive, sometimes bordering on suspicious, but guilt had kept him silent. Now, that same alibi would become her undoing. On the first day of surveillance, we set up near the house. She left in cycling gear, a helmet strapped under her chin, her bicycle mounted on the back of her SUV. She waved to the neighbors as though nothing were amiss, then drove off. We followed at a careful distance, avoiding suspicion. Instead of heading toward a trail or a park, she drove several miles into a quiet suburban area, pulling into the driveway of a modest home. We parked far enough away to observe, cameras ready. Moments later, a man appeared at the door. She didn't bother unloading her bike. Instead, she disappeared inside with him, and the door closed. 3 hours later, she emerged, still in her cycling clothes, adjusting her hair in the side mirror as though she had just returned from an exhausting ride. She drove back home without hesitation, parking the car with the bike untouched. To her husband, it looked like another day of exercise. To us, it was the beginning of a damning trail. Over the next 2 days, we repeated the process. The pattern never wavered. Each time, she left under the guise of cycling and ended up at the same man's house. Each time, she stayed hours. Each time, she returned pretending to have been on a ride. The brazenness of it was almost insulting. It wasn't clever. It wasn't careful. It was routine, and routine is the easiest thing in the world to expose. We documented everything: photos of her car arriving, timestamps of her entering, video clips of her leaving, images of her bike untouched. By the 3rd day, the evidence file was thick enough to silence doubt. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a full-fledged affair, repeated and deliberate. I could see the change in her father as we presented the evidence. He no longer looked conflicted or hesitant. He looked liberated. For years, he had second-guessed himself, believing her lies, doubting his instincts. Now, every suspicion he'd buried was laid bare. It wasn't paranoia, it was reality. And reality gave him clarity. Still, he hesitated on one point: the children. They had been raised under her dominance, shaped by her influence. How would they take the truth? Would they side with their mother out of loyalty, or would they finally see through her facade? It was a fair question, and one that couldn't be answered until the confrontation itself. But deep down, he knew. Children may be blinded for a while, but when the lies unravel, they recognize the truth. With the evidence secured, the plan shifted from investigation to strategy. This wasn't about exposing her carelessly, it was about dismantling her power with precision. We chose the perfect moment, a day when she was returning from a business trip. She would expect to come home, drop her bags, and resume her reign of control. Instead, she would walk into the fallout of her own betrayal. The days leading up to her return were a blur of preparation. We packed her belongings into boxes, stripping her presents from the house piece by piece. Clothing, personal items, trinkets, all of it loaded neatly into a truck. The home she once ruled no longer belonged to her. When she returned, she would find it waiting like a staged battlefield, the evidence assembled, the confrontation unavoidable. I watched as my ex and her father worked side by side, their bond mending with each passing moment. For the first time in years, they were united, not divided by the woman who had wedged herself between them. He looked at his daughter with pride, with gratitude, with the quiet recognition that she was the one saving him, not the other way around. The morning of her arrival, we rehearsed the plan. The evidence would be presented calmly, without rage or argument. The goal wasn't to scream or accuse, it was to leave her no escape, no defense, no option but to face the consequences. We weren't giving her an opening to spin the narrative. Everything would be laid out, irrefutable, undeniable. As the clock ticked, anticipation grew heavy in the air. My ex sat with the manila envelope in her hand, the photos and timestamps inside. Her father stood beside her, no longer a man burdened by years of manipulation but a father ready to reclaim his life. For once, he wasn't the one being silenced. He was the one holding the truth. When the sound of her car finally echoed in the driveway, we exchanged a glance. It was time. I thought the photos were enough, but I knew better than to rely on a single piece of evidence when dealing with someone as cunning as her. My ex's stepmother had lived her entire life weaving lies so effortlessly that she could make anyone believe her version of events. I couldn't let this chance slip. If she was going to be exposed, it had to be undeniable, airtight, and permanent. The morning after we showed the first photographs to her father, I decided that gathering more proof would be my responsibility. I was not just doing this for him. I was doing it for my ex, who had been cast aside and forgotten by her own father because of this woman's manipulations. And in a way, I was doing it for myself too, because watching justice unfold against someone so cold and selfish felt like reclaiming something lost. I told my ex that we needed to treat this like any other case from our PI firm. No emotions clouding judgment, no rush to act without strategy. She agreed, and so we began documenting every move her stepmother made. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge. Her supposed cycling routine was nothing more than a smokescreen. Almost every day, she would disappear for hours with her bike rack on the back of her car, only to meet the same man in different secluded spots. We followed them, taking photos, recording license plates, noting times and dates. Each time, it felt like she was handing us the rope to tighten around her own neck. By the third day, even her father couldn't deny what he was seeing. His voice cracked when he looked at the pictures, his wife leaning over the hood of her car, wrapped around another man, their intimacy captured in frame after frame. He had lived for years with a gnawing suspicion that something was wrong, but he had buried it, convincing himself he was imagining things. Now, with every new photograph, his denial dissolved, replaced by anger and a hunger for freedom. For me, it was more than anger, it was a quiet satisfaction. I had spent years uncovering the betrayals of strangers, presenting evidence to devastated husbands and wives who came to us in tears. But this time, it was personal. This time, I wasn't handing off a folder and walking away. This was about repairing a broken bond between a father and daughter who had been kept apart by lies. Still, evidence wasn't enough. Revenge wasn't just about proof, it was about timing, about making sure the downfall landed in the most devastating way possible. I urged patience, even though every part of me wanted to move forward. We waited until her stepmother left town for one of her business trips. That window gave us the perfect chance. While she was gone, we began preparing. Together with her father, we sorted through the house, packing her belongings neatly into boxes. Every drawer, every shelf, every closet was emptied with precision. I remember lifting photo frames off the walls, some with her smiling face still trapped behind the glass, and stacking them into a box like pieces of a past life ready to be erased. Her father worked silently, his expression grim, but in his eyes, I saw something new, relief. For the first time in decades, he was reclaiming control of his own home. Once the boxes were loaded into the truck, we sat at the kitchen table, waiting. My ex tapped her fingers on the folder containing every piece of evidence we had collected. I could feel the weight of it, not just in paper but in meaning. That envelope wasn't just proof of infidelity, it was years of manipulation coming undone. When the front door finally opened, the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. She walked in, her heels clicking across the floor, a rehearsed smile on her face. But the second she saw us sitting there, her expression shifted. Then her eyes landed on the manila envelope in her husband's hands, and the smile disappeared completely. The outburst came fast, sharp, like a whip crack. She demanded explanations, shouted accusations, even tried turning her fury toward my ex, calling her ungrateful, vindictive, cruel. But for the first time, her words held no power. She wasn't the woman controlling the narrative anymore. She was exposed, cornered, stripped of the lies she had always hidden behind. I didn't need to speak much. The evidence did all the talking. Her husband opened the folder and laid the photographs in front of her, one after another. With each picture, her voice grew shriller, her excuses weaker. She tried to spin stories, claimed they were misunderstandings, insisted we were out to destroy her. But even she could see the truth reflected in the images, undeniable and permanent. I watched my ex stand taller than I had ever seen her before. She wasn't the forgotten daughter anymore, not the girl shipped away to boarding school and erased from her father's life. She was the one holding the power now, the one whose smile widened as her stepmother's defenses crumbled. And in that moment, I felt the deepest sense of justice I had ever experienced. The argument dragged on, but in reality, it was already over. Her father's mind was made up. The relief in his face when he finally said he was done with her was almost breathtaking. Years of frustration, manipulation, and abuse seemed to lift off him in an instant. He wasn't just leaving a cheating wife, he was leaving behind a prison built of lies. As for her stepmother, the fury quickly gave way to desperation. She wanted to bargain, to claw back some sense of control. She tried threats, warnings about court battles, about custody, about taking everything she could. But we had planned for this. Every photograph, every note, every detail had been documented with care. She had no ground to stand on. In the end, the only thing she could do was walk away. She left the house she once ruled, her belongings already packed and waiting. She left her children behind, too consumed with her own freedom to fight for them. And as she stormed out, the silence that followed felt like victory itself. That night, I watched as my ex and her father sat together for the first time in years, not as strangers divided by manipulation but as family finally united again. He apologized through tears for the years he had lost, and she forgave him, knowing it had never truly been his choice. I sat quietly, letting the moment belong to them. For me, revenge had never been sweeter. This wasn't about destroying someone for the sake of it. This was about restoring something that should have never been broken. The stepmother thought she could rewrite history by erasing a daughter from her father's life, but in the end, she only wrote the story of her own downfall. And I was there to make sure every word of it was written in permanent ink. The silence in the house after she left lingered like a heavy fog. It wasn't just the absence of her voice, her demands, or her presence, it was the sudden weight of freedom settling into the walls. For years, she had filled every corner with her control, dictating who belonged and who didn't. Now, for the first time, that grip was broken. I remember watching my ex lean back in her chair, her face calm but her hands trembling. She had fought for this moment longer than anyone else, and though it felt like victory, it also carried the sharp ache of years stolen. Her father sat across from her, his head in his hands, tears streaking down his face. I didn't interrupt. This was their moment, not mine, and I wanted it to unfold naturally. He apologized again and again, his words raw and desperate, as if trying to make up for all the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days he had missed. My ex listened, her expression softening with every word. For so long, she had been cast aside, exiled like a mistake. Yet in that room, with the lies burned away, she was finally seen. That alone made every hour we spent gathering evidence worth it. But reconciliation was only part of it. Justice had to go beyond emotion, it needed permanence. That night, her father decided he was done with her stepmother completely. The documents were filed swiftly. Divorce papers, requests to transfer property, motions for custody were necessary, it all began moving within days. And because of the evidence we had collected, everything tilted in his favor. Her stepmother didn't go quietly. She tried to fight, of course. She hired lawyers, made dramatic accusations, and even tried to paint herself as the victim of a cruel setup. But lies have a short lifespan when weighed against cold, hard proof. Every photo, every timestamp, every note dismantled her arguments one by one. The courts didn't need to be convinced, the truth was there in black and white. I attended the hearings with them, not as a professional but as support. Watching her stepmother sit across the courtroom, her confidence shrinking each time her affairs were exposed, was more satisfying than I could ever admit out loud. She had spent years building her life on manipulation, but when it came under the scrutiny of truth, it collapsed like a house of cards. Her father walked away with the house, most of the assets, and full custody of the children. But more than that, he walked away with something greater, his daughter back in his life. And for my ex, that was the real victory. For years, she had believed she was unloved, unwanted. Now she saw the truth, she had always been wanted, always been loved, just hidden behind walls built by someone who thrived on control. the stepmother faded quickly after that. She moved out of town, chasing after the man she had risked everything for, only to discover he wasn't interested in building a future with her. Rumors trickled back occasionally: financial troubles, failed relationships, even whispers of her trying to manipulate someone new. But none of it mattered anymore. She was no longer in control, no longer able to touch the lives she had nearly destroyed. For me, the victory wasn't just in watching her fall, it was in seeing what grew in her absence. My ex and her father began rebuilding slowly. At first, it was awkward, filled with long silences and conversations that stumbled as they tried to bridge the years apart. But little by little, the walls came down. They shared meals, laughed over old stories, and even argued sometimes, but this time it was real, not controlled by someone else's agenda. One evening, months later, we sat in the backyard, the three of us, as her father grilled dinner. My ex leaned against me, and I looked around at the life that had been reclaimed. There was no tension, no fear, just the quiet rhythm of family. And I realized then that revenge hadn't just destroyed someone, it had healed what she had broken. I thought back to the first time I suspected her stepmother, the way my instincts had sharpened the moment I saw how she treated my ex. I had known she was dangerous, but even I hadn't realized just how much damage she had done until we pulled it apart piece by piece. To see her stripped of power, to see her reduced to nothing but her own lies, was the closure I hadn't even known I needed. But the real reward wasn't her downfall, it was watching my ex smile again, a genuine smile that came from being whole. She had carried scars that weren't visible, scars carved by rejection and abandonment. Now, with her father back in her life, those scars began to fade. And I knew that everything we had risked, every step we had taken, had been worth it. Revenge is often painted as destructive, as something that consumes the seeker as much as the target. But I learned something different. Revenge, when rooted in truth, doesn't have to be a fire that burns everything down. It can be a scalpel, cutting away the poison and leaving room for healing. What we did wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoration. Her stepmother may never understand the depth of what she lost. She thought she had secured her place forever, that manipulation and deceit would keep her throne intact. But power built on lies always crumbles. And when it did, she lost not just a marriage, not just a home, but the respect and influence she had once wielded like a weapon. We never spoke to her again. There was no need. Her story with us was finished, and she was nothing more than a shadow fading into the distance. What remained was stronger than what had been before: family reclaimed, trust restored, love unbroken. Looking back now, I realize that revenge wasn't the ending. It was the beginning. It gave us the closure we needed, the strength to rebuild, and the clarity to move forward without fear. And in the quiet of that new life, I finally felt peace. Because the greatest revenge wasn't just watching her fall. It was making sure she could never rise again in the lives she had once controlled. And that victory, silent and permanent, was ours to keep. If this story kept you on edge, imagine what's coming next. Revenge isn't just a tale, it's justice rewritten. Subscribe now, join our community, and never miss the next chilling twist. Every betrayal has its reckoning, and here, every secret ends with payback. Stay tuned, more awaits.